Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, knowing that people will still be hopping on and, certainly want to welcome everybody. I know a number of you were on our morning call and there was a fairly full explanation and introduction to this series, and I won't go through all of that again, but just in summary, this is in place of a Housing Justice Summit that we had sincerely hoped to do in a way that would speak to how important it is for organizations, DV organizations, to support survivors with housing stability. Those critical steps past crisis, emergency, sheltering, and housing. And that it makes such a difference when we are able to do that with our varying approaches to advocacy and the support of a great advocate, as I know everybody in your agencies is. And mostly just want to say that particularly during this time of first of all the racial disparities, the whole struggles related to race, disproportionality of housing justice, homelessness. I think, and I have a hard time with the words because I have looked over the past couple of weeks and the things that have happened in our country. And of course, I've been around for quite a while, a child of the 50s and a young adult and youth of the 60s and 70s. And I feel like I keep watching this over and over and over again, and have just gotten so frustrated and hope that this time with all of us, we can make some differences, some changes, some huge changes. And a part of that is with housing justice, because communities of color, especially African American and Native American, are disproportionately impacted by homelessness, as well as by COVID and by mass incarceration. So let's all work together and join together, each in our own space and certainly in the housing world, to do something about that for those who are survivors and walking in our doors. And of course, the other big thing still continues to be COVID. And I think COVID has certainly presented many challenges in terms of our historical way of providing emergency communal living shelter. And I know many of us who have had that are rethinking that, relooking at it. Some have been and have made some transformations. And hopefully this webinar series with this one related to the service package will help us all do that. So I think that is about it for my introduction, other than just pausing for a moment in terms of land recognition. And those who were here first, certainly where I live, the Tulalip Reservation is not far away, with the group of indigenous tribes that are on that reservation, and the Duwamish in Seattle. So again, hearts for the people who were here and their spiritual ancestors. So the presentation, we started this morning with what does it take to be a DV Housing First organization? What does it take to do Housing First? And spoke to the different things that are related to the whole philosophy of housing as a right. And we're springing off from that. Most of you, I think, heard it. For those of you that didn't, let me know and I can make sure that I send the slides out to you. So your hosts, I'm Linda Olson. I've been at the Coalition now for 10 years and have worked in the field for many, many years before that. Have appreciated the partnership I've had with Kendra Gritch for 7 out of those 10 years, and am delighted now to welcome a new partner, Jackie Hidalgo Mendez. And Jackie, would you just say hi and a few words about yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. I am, well, hello again, because a lot of people are were at this morning's, but to who weren't in this morning's webinar. My name is Jackie, and I am the housing coordinator at WSCADV.
So just a little bit, again, the brief reminder about what DV Housing First is. And so DV Housing First, of course, evolved 10 years ago with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and their investment was primarily to see if Housing First as a philosophy would work for DV survivors. And as they portioned out the money that they contributed to organizations, invested in organizations, half of that money was for our services package, and the other half was for the flexible financial assistance that was specifically for survivors at their direction. So this particular segment is Pillar 1, which what we evolved, again, this was a process, but what we came up with in terms of our services package. If you are familiar with Housing First as that philosophy, housing is a right, it came out of the housing homeless world, and it was specifically for those who were chronically homeless, had many issues with drug and alcohol, substance abuse problems, as well as mental health. And so that was the primary services package that was incorporated into Housing First for that particular population. And the evidence has been overwhelming that that has worked well, where we think about housing first and not housing ready. So our services and our service package really starts right at the very beginning of contact with a survivor, and it continues through to housing placement and after, so that somebody continues to have the support as they're trying to retain housing and to rebuild their lives. And so when we talk about survivor-driven advocacy, that is our key principle. It does come from our Washington Administrative Code. I've taken the phrase a little bit, just a little more emphasis in terms of survivor-driven, because we want to make sure that that we are supporting the survivor, that the survivor is the person in charge, focused on the survivor's choice, and we're oriented to that whole person, not just the domestic violence, and that we validate and accept the survivor for who they are and the way they come to us. And also that it's action-oriented. I think the only caution with that action-oriented might be it can take a while to figure out what the action is going to be for each survivor. So as I mentioned, there is that phrase in the Washington Administrative Code, advocacy on behalf of DV survivors, that focuses on safety planning, empowerment, education about domestic violence, and community resources. Those are all of the things that every single DV agency should be doing, and certainly the ones who have DSHS contracts are required to do. Advocates may do case management. There are a number of DV programs that also have housing homeless money invested in them, as well as the DV services they provide. And you will see them perhaps changing out the advocate term with case manager. I think of advocate as slightly different as far as the approach and how much the survivor is ultimately in charge. Same thing with counseling. There are a lot of advocates who also are therapists and have a background in counseling. And that can certainly be helpful for that survivor, depending upon the role of the advocate, to have somebody refer them to the appropriate outside counseling source, or maybe if it is a designated therapist position within the organization, help with that healing and cognitive change that could be available for them as a part of agency services. But the main thing that we are doing is meeting survivors where they are and accompanying them where they need to go, both literally and figuratively. So the meeting people where they're at is the most important. I don't doubt that several of you, maybe all of you, have at one time or another heard this particular training in its different iterations, but the emphasis is to connect. This isn't that meeting somebody with a checklist, a screening checklist. It is developing the human connection. And I know right now that's so hard. We're figuring out different ways to do it when we can't do it face to face. But just being assuring that their needs come first, that we're listening, we're giving space. You know, when we talk about survivor driven, and it's been criticized at times that so many survivors, we can't push them, we can't say, well, come on, you're driving this boat or this bus. We need to give them the space. And it's like anything, when we learn to drive a car, that takes time. You just don't get behind of the back of the wheel, although some people do. I think my husband did when he learned how to drive. But you need to learn, and you need to figure out where you're going. You need that map or the direction or the sense of purpose of why you're going to the place you're going. So ultimately, our role is to support that process of sometimes learning how to drive and certainly figuring out the best way to get there. And as with any good map application, if there are traffic jams or accidents along the way, those can pop up, and sometimes we have enough information that we can avoid them and pick a different way to go. And sometimes, you know, we just kind of plow right through, hoping that the traffic will change or the accident will go away in the process. Main thing is watch the checklists. I know we all have our intake lists that we need to complete. We all need to make sure that we are asking the realm of questions needed by the program and by funders. But the most you can do, the more you can do face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and just connecting and listening, the more helpful it is. So mobile advocacy, when we started this work, there was a project in Portland called Home Free, Volunteers of America, that the Gates Foundation had funded, and they suggested that we work with them, which was a total treat for me because I had already met Chris Billhart. Susan Hannibal, our DSHS contract manager at the time, had sent me Chris's way in terms of some of the things I wanted to do at that time with my shelter program. And so the mobile advocacy that they were doing there and their approach to that was something that we definitely incorporated in a way that it's, you know, it's really hard to do housing search. It's hard to connect in the community if we are tied to shelter shifts or tied to being in a facility. So getting mobile, having the staffing structure to be mobile is so critical with this particular initiative. So meeting survivors where they are, literally walking alongside of them. I don't know of anything more rewarding than walking alongside of a survivor and having that privilege, that honor of hearing their story and participating in their journey and answering questions or maybe nudging here and there along the way. And it is an honor, and just one of the reasons why I know I did it and why all of you undoubtedly do this work. Speaking on behalf of, certainly when we have permission to do that, and for many, when we get in stressful situations, the words don't always come very well, or knowing the right words to say in a certain, again, situation, and being able as an advocate to help with that. And then support their self-advocacy. So when we talk about walking alongside and speaking on behalf of, so many advocates, the ones that I just have such admiration for, will speak to how they will do that in terms of taking the lead, oftentimes the first time, And then the second time, they are maybe just with the survivor, and the survivor is clearly taking the lead. And then the third time, the advocate steps back and says, you go do this and tell me how it went. So just that supporting self-advocacy for survivors as you're working with them. Survivor-driven mobile advocacy, again, this is just kind of a little recap, a different way with a cute cartoon to say pretty much what I just said. But we're asking, what do you need? Instead of, here's the list, here's the menu of our services that you might be eligible for, or that we are funded to provide for you. So starting out with the needs, and then it would be the role of the advocate to kind of identify how in those services that need or those needs can be addressed and met, hopefully in a fairly seamless way, and being really transparent and honest if there is something needed that there simply isn't the resource or capacity for, which doesn't mean you might not try to find that, but thinking about the needs first versus this is what we do, will you fit in? And I know nobody asks it quite like that, but sometimes that's the way it's heard when there's just that list and somebody hasn't even had a chance to think about why am I here? What are all of my needs? And actually, I'm not hearing on that menu the things I might need the most in the moment. So that must mean I am not the appropriate client for this organization. So meeting survivors literally where they are, helping them to navigate other support systems. It is so critical to always consider a survivor's culture and community in order to increase safety and rebuild connections. So many times we hear cultural competency, and I don't know that any of us can be competent in another person's culture. Cultural sensitivity might be a little better, cultural humility, but I think ultimately just being mindful to the fact that this survivor is coming often from a very different place culturally and a very different community, and to be humble about that and supportive in terms of where they're coming from. One of the things that's important to remember with mobile advocacy is the context. Mobile advocacy has been around for a long, long time, hasn't necessarily been called that, but this is where we started. This is where DVSA programs, volunteer agencies, original advocates, this is what we did before we had facilities. Early 70s to mid 70s, before the first shelters started being built or identified. We met people. We had those ridiculous pagers, or we figured out other ways to connect. And we went to them or to a safe place that they identified. And this has been the way culturally specific communities operated and continue to operate. For an example, the promotora model, which is culturally sensitive for the Latinx communities and used throughout the US to address domestic violence, chronic disease, and oral health. This is where you don't necessarily see people being able to easily get from where they are into wherever your program or you are. So it's important to be able to have a safe way, a safe method to find them and connect with them. In our area in King County, and inspired by the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, we call natural helpers. And those again are volunteers, and now often compensated volunteers that are in and of the community and do activities to reach out to people in those communities that are informational about sexual and domestic violence. So people don't have to identify that they are a domestic violence, sexual violence victim or survivor, but they can listen to folks who are having conversations about how family relationships could and should be, more about what are those healthy relationships, What are the life skills that might be needed in a new country if they are working with refugees or immigrants? So it's a different sort of approach that often reveals, again, domestic and sexual violence, trafficking, both labor and sex industry trafficking, and helps us reach out in a different way, or a way other than what we've been doing so frequently. So we're going back to our roots, and we're embracing a method and approach that has worked very well and continues to do so for many culturally specific communities, both in our urban and rural areas. It's not just about a car. Everybody often gets concerned if they either don't have a car, don't want to drive. It can be transit, Uber, Lyft, and taxis, but it's also just meeting people someplace. Much as I like to have the car time with somebody, because you can do so much in terms of role playing on the way to wherever it is you're going, it works to meet somebody there. You're still supporting them in that appointment. The housing search, being able to look at apartments and help them fill out applications and sometimes go through the inspections. Transporting. There are times when there simply is not a means of transport for survivors. And so for us to be able to provide that, support them in that, when there's no transit in a certain area, or if there is, it's not safe. I remember hearing one story of an abusive partner who knew all the bus stops in this rural community and would basically stake them out to watch for their partner. Helping bridge a language barrier. And that could be with landlords, and this isn't necessarily interpretation. This is just some of the complicated language that we tend not to have literacy with if we don't use it every day. I just did a mortgage refinance, and I looked at all of those pages of gobbledygook and thought, oh my gosh, I have no idea half of the stuff that I'm signing off on. And sometimes it's really important for a survivor to really understand what it is, what document they're looking at, what they are hearing, and the application for that. So advocates are critical there. And of course, all those in-person advocacy meetings, wherever that survivor might identify, whatever is good. It might be their home or workplace. There were wonderful stories from one program that was working with a survivor, and her place of employment was very supportive of her. And that was where they were able to meet with her and meet with her safely. Coffee shops can work depending upon confidentiality, but again, we always liked the McDonald's sorts of examples where there was a play area for the kids. And why mobile advocacy? I think just with all of those different examples, it lowers barriers to services. It kind of helps eliminate some of the geographic transportation barriers, depending upon where you're meeting with somebody. Many folks will meet with survivors in parks, and the kids can be playing on swings or in that McDonald's play area. Folks are often not as intimidated when they are able to choose the place that they would like to meet. They have a little bit of power over that. And sometimes people don't want to use the traditional entry points. Maybe you've got an office front in downtown, whether it's a larger community or a bigger community. Folks might not want to walk through your doors because of what everybody in that community knows that you are. It restores power, as I've already mentioned. It also gives them a little bit more of an equal footing with the advocate. Just that power balance is a little not quite so tilted. And there is a choice as to where this work is going to happen. Let's see, most of this I just talked about, but entering the survivor's world, I think is a gift. Being able to meet survivors in that place that matters to them or that they feel safe in. I remember working with a survivor who loved to shop, and so her favorite and actual safer place in terms of her abusive partner was the mall. And there was a mall that had a little kiddie area, and that was where the kids could be. So entering that world and getting a better understanding of the framework, and it certainly helps social isolation, helping people get out and have a reason to. And finally, the know-how, collaboration, and partnerships can happen anywhere. And one of the things that we at the coalition really like about mobile advocacy is it puts advocates in the community. And we talk about the educational opportunities where we're distributing pamphlets or doing educational sessions, but this with a survivor actually gets us into that partnership in the community and helps promote connection to community networks in a way that doesn't happen otherwise. So mobile services, how do you do it? Your community considerations have to take into mind the geographic distances. Chances are, if you are in a very rural area or any more in an urban area with lots and lots of traffic, you might not be able to serve as many people in a day, or maybe not very many at all by the time you meet up or connect with somebody that's a ways away. The availability of resources in those communities, what kind of community it is, and the racial and cultural composition. And program considerations when you're developing this is the staffing structure. How are you training and supervising folks? The need for technology and equipment. Folks need their laptops, iPads, their cell phones, agency-funded issued equipment for the work that they're doing out in the field, as well as that method of transportation, which could be a variety of things. People might not want to have a car, need to have a car. There are other ways to do that, from car rental if it's absolutely necessary to Uber and Lyft and taxis. There is one organization that works in downtown Seattle, and really none of the advocates have a vehicle, and they do everything via either transit or Uber or Lyft. So the big question is, how can survivors be safe in their communities? Well, and I'm going to stop for just a moment before I plunge into that. Is there, and I know I've asked Jackie to kind of watch chat boxes and if people have questions. And let's just pause for a moment, just for the sake of conversation, because I think I might have been throwing a lot out there. I know many of you are already familiar with DV Housing First and undoubtedly mobile advocacy, but I would love to hear from you.
Actually, Linda, I was about to ask you, so you are my mind reader right now. But with respect to mobile advocacy, I think that this would be such a good time to kind of ask if anybody's had any unique ways that they've been addressing or gotten there's a word that's not in my head right now, but when it comes to mobile advocacy within their agencies, any creative, yeah, that was the word, any creative new ways that they've been able to kind of work with their survivors, especially right now with respect to COVID.
I'm a shelter manager at CADA, and through COVID, I've housed 2 people in the community. So, and I'm really sad because we have a van that I can't use. But anyway, so I've met them. I've met our residents that I've sheltered at, because I do help them find housing, and we go look at apartments together. So through COVID, with 2 of my residents that we've housed for a long time. So they've been with us almost 24 months through transitional housing. So I've met them at their apartments. Instead of me driving them, I've just met them there. So we went in separate cars. We've had our masks on. The realtors aren't meeting us there now. So it's like there's a code on the door that we get the key out of. and I didn't touch any of those things. I mean, it would be her place. So she's the one that got the key. You know, I was just mostly there for support. So I mean, and our director is very good. Cindy Robinson's our director. So every time I call to ask, hey, is this something I can do? Which, because I would do everything, mind you. That's just me. But I always have to run it by my director. So she said, if you feel safe, then yeah, I can do it. So, because our agency is not really seeing people in our office either, although I'm at the shelter, so I still have people that live there that I see. So that's just one example of housing. I mean, we still have to look for housing for our people. So that's one thing that you can do. And also one other thing, I'm still looking for housing for one other person that she doesn't have a vehicle. So I go look, take pictures, bring it back. And then if it's something that she is interested in, which I haven't found one yet that she's interested in, I could maybe bring her. I don't know if my director would approve that one yet. I haven't asked because she doesn't have a vehicle. So it's difficult, but we gotta try and figure it out because they still need housing. So if anybody has any ideas other than that, besides the pictures online, please share.
Yeah, I also see a couple of individuals putting that they're only providing services by phone in the chat box.
Here at Healthy Families, I'm an advocate here at Healthy Families. One of the things that we've done is a couple of the advocates, we've gone on walks with a couple of clients. And so we make sure that we keep the distance, but as the advocate that assists a lot with our housing, because we kind of tend to split up our jobs, but I'm the main housing advocate. That was one of the first things that I noticed is interaction, human interaction. So it's making sure that they were okay. And walks were just something that have worked out really, really good with our housing clients. And it worked so well that we've used it with our other clients that we are just communicating with, and we're offering that. We have an advocate here who's met clients at the college. We have some tables that are nicely spaced apart, and so it's away from the office, somewhere where they can meet, and somewhere where it's just beautiful up here. So they're able to enjoy the sunlight. So the COVID's been difficult, but just figuring out what it is that they need, asking them what they need, and meeting them where they're at.
In one training, and this was not during COVID time, but where they like to meet people would certainly apply, but the cemetery, it was in a location out of the way and felt really safe and confidential in so many ways. So that had been a new one for me, but it just again amazed me at the creativity of advocates working with survivors and how they figure out together where there could be safe places to meet, especially now during COVID, where you wouldn't want to put somebody in your car. And I know I'm back in the days pre-COVID where I would never give it a second thought, but just the challenges that we're facing right now. Well, one of the biggest challenges in terms of talking about this and rolling out mobile advocacy and the presence in the community is always safety. We've built up over the years in our field just the realization that so many survivors are in such dangerous situations and are partnered or have exes in their lives that are very dangerous. And the reality of what can we do to make sure that safety is always front and center for survivors, as well as for the advocates meeting them. One of the kind of those tensions when we think about our emergency shelters, temporary housing, whatever we want to call that, is that it tends to be hidden away and confidential, and nobody can tell anybody where they are. And while it can certainly be helpful as far as the overall safety, one of the things that is lost is the complete severance of a survivor with their community. Too many times they don't have the ability to get back into their community because of transportation concerns, the fear that they might be followed or tracked back. Because the situation is communal, we are thinking about the safety of the entire household. And too many survivors would leave shelter, as I recall, because they couldn't connect with their friends easily. They couldn't have their mom come and visit, or their kids couldn't have sleepovers, and all of the different things in a family's life often ended because of that safety measure. And while there are definitely those that welcome that and need that complete isolation and safety, the danger is so great. I would say the majority need the community connection and the ability to do that. So that leaves us with asking, how can survivors be safe in their community, and what can we do? So one of the things I've done throughout this presentation is linked to the presentation places on our webpage and our toolkit that you can go to. So now I'm going to try and do something. We'll see if I can manage this, of moving over to this screen over to our webpage. So our toolkit includes all of the information about safety planning for mobile advocacy. This has been revamped recently, updated, and it should have some great information. So yeah, down here there's a safety planning policy and protocol, and this came from Volunteers of America Home Free. And this is a great urban plan for working with survivors and the safety planning that goes with that. So these are just basically your hints for safety planning, and certainly something for advocates to work with, train with, feel comfortable moving with. It is important that there be good supervision for mobile advocacy, and that staff has the information they need to work on their own. You've really got to be a great independent worker, and supervisors need to figure out ways not to micromanage, but still be supportive and connected. And there definitely needs to be transportation reimbursement if somebody using their own car, and cell phones. So I'm going to move away from the mobile part and get into our trauma-informed. And as I mentioned earlier today with our group of folks this morning, in addition to the work that we do with trauma-informed services and culture, we are adding to this particular webinar traumatic brain injuries, because that is such a critical piece of information that we all should have. And I want to make sure that it is spread more widely across WSCADV, and so happy that we will have Heather in a little bit, and I will have to get back to that video, but I'll figure it out. So just starting with something, again, that I believe most of you know, is that our work has to be trauma-informed. And that means establishing safety within the relationship, being aware of triggers. And for so many people who are advocates, as I mentioned this morning, we often come from places where we've experienced trauma, where we are ourselves survivors. Maybe we've experienced that long history of historical trauma, and we can be triggered. So there's just that sense of being aware of that for ourselves as advocates, as well as for the people that we're working with. The idea that we have to help people rebuild control. That's one of the most traumatizing things that can happen to an individual, is losing their autonomy, their sense of control over their life, over their actions. So helping people rebuild that. And so much of that all happens through connection. Connection is healing. Safe connections with people are an important way to heal. So these are just reminders of trauma, what it is. I think you all probably have had these trainings, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that trauma just isn't necessarily one single event. It can be, but usually it's an ongoing series of events woven throughout a life cycle. And as we think about the intergenerational cycle of trauma, that changes the brain, doesn't end. For us to remember that stress and traumatic experiences actually change our brain structure. Those of you who have had rookies, especially when Tara Lindquist was teaching rookies, she went into great detail about brain development and how traumatic experiences literally rewire brain circuits. The PTSD symptoms that might result are the behavioral manifestation of these changes. And again, as we are often overworked advocates who are stretched thin, it can be so easy, and I'm speaking from my personal experience and the fact that I'm often a very impatient person. I like to get things done, and I have my schedule, and I want to keep moving. And there are times in my history of being an advocate where the person I was working with just wasn't there, just couldn't be there. Maybe not physically, often mentally. And so thinking and reminding oneself that trauma responses are completely normal. This is not necessarily a person who's resistant or hard to work with or difficult. It might feel very difficult, but what's going on in that person's brain and the way they're responding is completely normal for the brain messages that are putting that person into survival brain and saying, be careful, take care. These strategies may be long-term patterns, and they may not be easily discarded. It takes a long time to heal. So just different ways that it will show up. I will zip through this, and of course the slides will be available for you to get, but the reminder of some of the challenging ways it shows up. You know, that loss of sense of time and space. I have a colleague that talked about people being spacey at times, and you know, sometimes again when we are anxious to get things done, it is slowing, and the reminder of what the impacts might be is important to us to be aware of. You know, you think of just the self-centered focus, and you know, we often are very critical of people that we consider are selfish, and I think the reality of remembering again that someone who's experienced trauma just might not have the awareness of others, or even the full awareness of themselves and what's happening. Abstract concepts and information processing. This is kind of our indicator that these are times when you don't dump a whole lot of information. You know, there were many times at shelter, somebody would come in and we would have the whole list of shelter rules and shelter dynamics and what they had to do and remember and getting along with people, and then expect folks to remember that, even if we did hand them the printed copy. But again, thinking about where folks might be and how difficult that could be, whether We've moved from that place of a shelter intake into what does this mean for somebody who needs to look for housing and probably is having challenges with childcare, or maybe CPS is in their life. And you get all of the complicated things and all of these different systems that are demanding that somebody be on time and understand just the different concepts that are being presented. And sometimes those concepts, and if the information isn't really processed and responded to in a way, can have devastating consequences. So a trauma-informed approach, again, there's that highlight that means there's a link and we're not going to go to it. It's there. But the approach is safety and just being aware of the physical and emotional safety and the awareness of triggers, building trust. The relationship is just paramount. And that consists of transparency, clarity, consistency, and healthy boundaries, and honesty. I appreciated sitting in a focus group with women who had been homeless and traumatized in LA. And one of them, and most of these women had been sex workers and had histories of incarceration. And one of them in particular talked about the fact that her advocate was honest, told her the truth, that if she couldn't do something, she would let her know that. If she said she was going to get a document, either the document was there at the time that she committed, or she was back to that person saying why it wasn't and when it would be. So just really not going into our hopeful place of what we hope we can do or what maybe we can do if the stars align, but the honesty and clarity and our boundaries. And ultimately the choice, rebuilding control, collaboration, please avoid hierarchy. And you know, that can be hard because you are in an authority position in so many situations when you're working with an advocate, especially if you have control in one way or another, or perceive control over their housing, whether that is that shelter space or whether that is your ability to work with them and your time to work with them. They see you as an authority figure. So doing the best you can to share power and act as a partner makes such a difference. And empowerment, strengths-based. Not just doing things for them, as I mentioned with the advocate example earlier, but building skills and encouraging them to do it for themselves with your feedback and guidance. And this is one of my favorite quotes that came out of our most recently completed update on where we are with DV Housing First. And this was a focus group, don't remember which community, but I remember the survivor. They don't ever doubt you. Speaking of advocates, they don't ever make you feel less, or you're a liar, or your story doesn't matter. It's the first time anybody has ever listened to me, ever. This is where we are getting into traumatic brain injuries, and it will take me a little bit of time to find the video since I negotiated away from it. But the video that we have from the Veterans Administration was put together by Daniel Overton, whom I met a couple of years ago and had the delightful coincidence that I happened to know his partner. She had been a colleague of mine in the world of domestic violence years ago. So for him to take the time to do this, and for Heather to commit the time to be here, answer questions, introduce and present, is such a gift and a blessing. And I would like to just turn it over to you, Heather, and I will futz around with my with the video.
Yes, absolutely. I had it on mute just to kind of cut down on some of the background noise for everybody. Like Linda said, my name is Heather Boehm. I'm from the eastern side of the state. I'm located outside of Spokane, and I'm responsible for traumatic brain injury, dealing with veterans. in Eastern Washington. And that does kind of entail about 2,000 square miles, which is a very large catchment for us. But the prelude into that is I actually spent 22 years in the Army. My husband's a TBI survivor, and we have 4 children together. And so at the end of the day, it's something that we live, that it's part of my life. So I was very passionate about it when I came into DBA. So it's just something that I feel that a lot of our family and our veterans, because, you know, as a spouse, even though I served in the military, I was still a spouse first and foremost, and a mother. And so a lot of times people don't realize that, you know, we serve as well as, you know, being that spouse, and how to really kind of filter that into our families and what we're looking for. So a lot of times when I'm working with veterans, it's actually the spouses and the dependents that are actually coming to me first rather than the veteran, because the veteran doesn't necessarily reach out. A lot of that, there's a lot of stigma around that. And a lot of times they don't realize that there's something going on. Their spouse knows there's something going on. And they've kind of come to that point where like, we don't know what else to do. And then a lot of times we see our kids, you know, my kids are playing, you know, with their kids, or they're at school. And then all of a sudden somebody finds out what I do for a living. And then, you know, then the parents will come over and start asking me questions because they relate. So a lot of times that's kind of how I kind of stumble upon a lot of these things. It's really, you know, the family that's affected greatly, and it's the children and the spouse, you know, either husband or wife. And it's that survivor piece. So they're expected to be a caregiver for their veteran, but then they're expected, you know, but they're also kind of that survivor themselves, because they're having to kind of navigate these waters of IPV and domestic violence, which is something that, you know, is, you know, we just don't talk about in the military. But the fact of the matter is, it's the only way we can kind of help them navigate these waters is to start talking about it.
My name is Dan Overton, and I am the program manager for the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs Traumatic Brain Injury Program. I'm here with Heather Bain, who is the Program Specialist 3 over in the Spokane area. And we'd like to start off by just thanking Linda and the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence for allowing us to be here and present the information to you. Today we hope to cover some real basic information to illuminate some of the issues that we've been seeing, and hope to work with you all on. First, let me show you some of the things that we see. First of all, a brain injury can result from all kinds of things, but in terms of like looking at the population and the demographic that we're talking about here, we'll focus on a few things. First of all, choking. A lot of people don't associate choking with brain damage and brain injury, but choking causes hypoxia. And whenever we deprive oxygen to the brain, we're killing off brain cells. Who knows where? It's very diffuse, and it's very hard to monitor, track, and identify, but there's absolutely no question of whether it's there or not. It's definitely there. The other thing we see is if a person is pushed down or into a solid object, what happens is that the brain is made of this kind of gelatinous goo that floats around upside in your brain or your skull, supported by cerebral spinal fluid. So when the skull stops, the brain doesn't necessarily stop, and will smack onto the inside of that skull and bounce around within it. That motion, that jiggling motion, causes damage to the axons, which is a very, very fragile part of the neuron. And whenever that is stretched, torn, or otherwise damaged, the neuron dies. And as the neuron dies, it kind of, explodes. And the explosion, when it disintegrates, it releases a lot of the neurotransmitters that it's been using to communicate with other cells. And that release causes the other cells around it to, overload. And as they overload, they're going to die as well. So one little injury from a small smack or fall can cause pretty significant injury within the brain. Also, just being shaken shaken violently, that throws the head back and forth in almost a whiplash form. And even though there's not necessarily any contact with anything, the brain inside the skull is bashing back and forth on the really bony and sharp parts of the inside of the skull. As it does so, what happens is there's different densities within the brain, and those will slide against one another, tug against one another, and as they do so, it can cause damage to these things called microtubules, which are inside that axon that help the neurons to communicate. Unfortunately, what we also know about this damage to the microtubules is that is one of the primary causes of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which we have seen in a lot in our military and in our NFL. And I suspect that when we get around to researching the survivors of IPV and domestic violence, we'll see that there as well. Now, being hit with an object. This is a very interesting study. This study particularly was from soccer players. And you think hitting a soccer ball is not a big deal, but there's an energy transfer that's going between the ball and the skull, and that energy is transferring through the skull into the brain. What they found was that these pathways, these major pathways that are in the brain, are unraveling and fraying like a rope with these repeated, very, very, very subconcussive events where the person isn't necessarily even knowing that any damage is going on. What happens is that with that energy transfer and that pathway going, there's just not the pathway which you see here. This is a healthy brain taken in that study. The lines that you see that look like colored yarn are these major pathways. So you can think about those like a freeway or a highway. So like I-5 or 101. And it just makes it easier for the brain to communicate with other parts of the brain. And it makes it faster for information to get from one place to another. So when you look at the other brain in the study, the brain of the 26-year-old soccer player, you see this. And granted, there's still a lot of connections going on, but those pathways are not there. It's just they're just gone. And it doesn't mean that there is necessarily less neurons, meaning there's not cell death, like we saw related to the other two issues, but these pathways are going to make it just that much harder for the brain to communicate with itself, for messages to get from one place to another, for a person to be able to think quickly and on their feet and be able to perform tasks as they usually used to do. It would be like if I-5 or one of the major highways or interstates were shut down. You can still get from one place to another. It's just going to take you that much longer to do so. Now, just to I'm sure that most of you are aware of these statistics, and I'm not a big fan of just throwing statistics out there, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all at the same basis of understanding. There was a study done in New York that looked at domestic violence and IPV and brain injury, and found that 92% of the women questioned had been hit in the head by their partners more than once. 83% had been hit in the head and shaken severely. 8% were hit in the head over 20 times in the preceding year. That was based on the New York State Office for Prevention of Domestic Violence. Another study done by the Ohio State University saw that 81% of women who have been abused at the hands of their partners and seek help have suffered a head injury. 83% had been strangled, and almost half of the women in the study said they'd been hit in the head or their head had been shoved into another object too many times to remember. So what these statistics basically show us is that it's like being trauma informed. If you are sitting across from somebody and you're trying to work with them in any situation in this particular demographic, it's almost safe to assume that on some level, in some part of their history, they have had a head injury, an injury to their brain. So what does that mean to them? Well, there's every brain injury is different and every individual is different. But when brain injury, when we look at its kind of typical symptoms, they're broken into 3 different categories: behavior, mood, and cognition. And all of these categories, we find that there are certain symptoms that occur more regularly than others. Before I go into that, though, I would like to bust a few myths, because it's one of the problems that we see ourselves dealing with trying to allow people to reach out and seek out the help that they need. See, a lot of people don't think that the injury is bad enough to cause damage, because they're thinking on more of what their doctors are telling them. So if I were to fall down and hit my head and I were to be knocked unconscious, I go down to the emergency room, and the emergency doctor is going to say, "Hey, how long were you out?" I say, "Oh, I don't know, maybe like 5 minutes." I just go, "Oh, that's no problem. Yeah, you probably just got a concussion. Go home, take it easy." I'd be like, "Wow, wait, I mean, I hit my head pretty hard there." The thing is that the medical community is concerned about the mortality of the injury. By everything we know, I'm not going to die from that. My brain's not injured to the point of needing treatment. So that tends to make me feel like I'm okay. See, this particular, what you see in front of you is the medical model of traumatic brain injury. I have to be out, loss of consciousness, LOC is the end one there. I have to be out for more than 30 minutes to even reach a moderate brain injury. That's a long time. Post-traumatic amnesia is the middle column there. I have to lose that more than a day's worth of memory. And the last thing is the Glasgow Coma Scale, which is a scale kind of like the APGAR scale for babies, but for coma patients. And basically, what this is showing is I have to really have a pretty significant injury to make to a moderate level. At that moderate level, I probably would be admitted and probably get an X-ray or CAT scan to see if there's any bleeding or pressure in the brain. But most 80%, actually more than 80% of everybody who has any kind of an injury to their head or brain injury is going to fall into that mild category and not really come to the awareness of the medical community. And you know from the statistics that I just showed you, and from a lot of the people that you deal with, a lot of the IPV and domestic violence survivors are not going to report to the doctor's office, period. So they're gonna be trying to figure out how to manage themselves at home with sometimes a significant brain injury. So the question comes, do you have to lose consciousness even to have a brain injury? And the answer is no. Well, what we know is that a lot of the significant brain injuries that are from repetitive subconcussive events, meaning that you're not even going to know that you're concussed. You're going to have your bell rung, you're going to see stars, and that means that there has been some damage to the brain. A lot of people will say you'll recover, but recovery is not bringing those cells back. Recovery is basically your brain adapting to the loss of those cells. The main takeaway from this, and what I really want to impart, is that the severity of the injury, which we see here and the medical community recognizes, the severity of the injury does not equal the severity of the symptoms, especially if there are repeated injuries. So, looking at some of those symptoms again. So hopefully you get that we've established that a lot of the folks you're seeing have numerous brain injuries by the time they reach you. What do these brain injuries mean to them? Well, what it means is it's going to make it even more difficult for them. They've got so much on their plate already. And I kind of hate to be the harbinger of bad news, but so much on the plate already, and we're adding this to the equation, because when it comes to behavior, we're going to see things like they're going to be more impulsive. They're going to have a snap judgment. They're not going to be able to process their judgments like they did before. they're going to probably have increased isolation. We see this an awful lot, mainly because there's a part of us that knows that we're not capable and that we overload too easily. Typically, they will have sleep disorders and chronic fatigue, which combined, it makes for a very difficult, kind of sluggish brain to deal with. And with all of that stuff, the impulsiveness, snap judgment, isolation, sleep disorder, and chronic fatigue, it's easy to see why there's a 60% higher risk of substance abuse in brain injury survivors. We also typically see changes to the mood in terms of volatile irritability. Well, what I mean by that is folks tend to have that irritability already, but it will just flash. And I'll hear people say, I'm just a snap case and I don't like it. I was not that way before. I will just go off on people. They will have a 150% increased risk of depression. Actually, the CDC came out a couple years ago and kind of said, after any brain injury, you can expect depression because that's an imbalance of brain chemicals. And after your brain's been bonked about a bit inside your skull, you can probably expect some imbalances for a while. A poor emotional control. Folks they will often say that they feel like they're bipolar. I'm all gas and no brake. And it's really not a mood disorder. It's more of their inability to really manage their emotions. Oftentimes, we will see an increase in people being diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Studies show that there's an increased risk of 60% in those folks. And unfortunately, that last statistic kind of, again, makes sense when you consider depression, poor emotional control, impulsivity, snap judgment. We see a 300% increased risk in suicide patients and brain injury survivors. Cognition, the thinking process, is a little bit easier for us to spot because it is absolutely a brain issue. We'll see folks complain of a lot more mental fatigue. And mental fatigue just comes about because the brain has to work harder to do what it used to do. So what used to be easy now takes a lot more energy and actual brain energy to complete. So people will fatigue that much quicker. They also won't recover from that fatigue as quickly as they used to, and they won't recover as much as they used to. So it's really important for folks with brain injuries to know to pace themselves and to take breaks very often, and try and make those breaks as impactful on allowing their brain to relax as possible. They will also have poor and erratic memory. This comes from the brain's inability to focus and the person's increased distractibility. They'll have problems and difficulty processing new information. They oftentimes, the adaptation will be this kind of nod and smile thing, like I'm following. But if you ask them what they heard, to repeat it or write it down, they just couldn't track. It needs to be very small pieces of information that are given to a person and given to them repetitively to really be able to help things sink in, to be able to use the things we know about memory to be able to help them out. A lot of folks will complain of sensory and information overload. Kind of like the brain just said, I've had it. I can't do anymore. This is too tough. And it just shuts down. Kind of like a computer locking up when you're asking it to do too much. We all have that, but after a brain injury, it just becomes more of a hair trigger, and you can't take as much. So maybe I used to be able to take half an hour of going into a busy shopping area before I just kind of said, I gotta go. And that after brain injury, that might be down to 15 minutes instead of saying, I gotta go. I might go, yeah, and just kind of lose it a little bit. Also, there, as I mentioned before, with behavior, poor impulse control. It's it's just not there. A lot of the things that we look to for the brain to be able to give us that second beat, that opportunity for some good thought, it's just not there. The brain just seems to want to just run right through these barriers, and it can create quite a problem for lots of folks, especially those folks that you're dealing with. So, what to do? Well, as you already know, the survivors that are dealing with a lot by the time that they reach out for help. So the effects of the brain injury can just make things that much harder on them. What we want to do is we similar to being trauma informed, we want to start by just being aware that the chance of us, the person sitting across from us having a brain injury and having some of those issues that I just described is pretty darn good. You know, so there's a reason to take this kind of brain injury approach. There's not really much to add to the approach that you've already gotten from being trauma informed, because that works really, really well. But it's just really important to watch for that sensory overload, try and make things short, repetitive, and some other things. Understand that the brain that you're working with is not functioning very, very well right now. Oftentimes, we as professionals, we've seen this time and time again, so we know what to do, and we will say, listen, you got to do this, this. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then unfortunately, the brain's hearing A, B, and then done. So just we need to remind ourselves to slow down and just take it easy and make sure that we're communicating effectively. All the research that is out there, well, nearly all the research is out there, when it really comes to the conclusion, what's the best thing we can do right now, and that is educate. But we only want to do that, obviously, once the safety has been established. But once safety has been established, it's really important to ask about head injuries and include in brain injury in any curriculum or resources or programming. There's a lot more that can be done. And we here, Heather and I, we'd be more than happy to sit with anybody and take some deeper dives into what we can do. But if we can help this individual understand the brain that they're dealing with, hopefully we can help them navigate and mitigate some of those problem areas that I just discussed. Because we can't really do much about the injury itself, but we can do a lot about the brain that's left and some of the symptoms that are going to possibly be some additional stumbling blocks for the people that we're trying to help. Some folks that might be able to help you out as you go through this journey, the BIWA, the Brain Injury Alliance of Washington. They have podcasts, they've got resource lines, they've got access to support groups. They've got a lot of information. The majority of the information that is there, I can't speak to the confidentiality of their lines. Just simply because I can't. I don't know their level of confidentiality, but there's a lot of information there. The information does tend to be more towards those folks who have a solid diagnosis, meaning that they're moderate to severe and survivors of brain injury. And sometimes I've noticed that the folks that we're talking about here that have these more concussive related symptoms can seem a little lost, but they're there and they're a great resource. Another one is the Traumatic Brain Injury Council of Washington. By the recent RCW that passed, they created a website that has a lot of information about screening, about different techniques and how to go about things, and maybe where to find some more resources. The one thing they didn't include as a resource is us, but we're talking to them about adding us because we think it's a pretty darn good resource. Resource to you, even though it says, Department of Veterans Affairs. And you say, well, we're not really dealing with a lot of veterans. Maybe not, but you're probably dealing with a few, and you probably have dealt with a few and will deal with a few. If you ever come across a veteran that you're working with, we could really, really be a great resource to them. I say that because there's a lot of additional resources that are available to veterans that may not be available to civilian counterparts. And we would know about some of those and be able to connect them to them. Plus, I can speak to our confidentiality, which is absolutely solid, ironclad. If you were to call us and ask us about a situation or how to deal with something or how to help or some education stuff, we don't need to know your name. We don't need to know where you're from. We don't need to know the person's name. We don't need to have any information to be able to help you out. So on top of that, let's just say it's absolutely ironclad. And the other thing is that we can provide, not only can we provide case management and referral stuff, but we can provide education. You want us to come out and do a brown bag to your staff, no matter where you are in the state, we'd be happy to do so. And we'll provide free CEUs as a boot. So there's a lot of things that we can help out with, and we would be more than happy to. We're really looking forward to working more closely with everybody who's listening here and everybody who you're working with. The other thing I'd like to share before I go is the Max Impact. It's an app, it's a smartphone app that we created for the brain injured veterans in Washington State. Now, you may think that an app for brain injured veterans aren't going to be very effective, but what's in here is a bunch of stuff that might be helpful. First of all, understand this is an absolutely anonymous app. There is no tracking going on. There is no data mining going on. The veterans said they wanted something that is anonymous, that nobody can tell who they are or where they're using it. Great, no problem. We don't have a problem with that. So it is absolutely anonymous and absolutely free on both the Google and the Apple platforms. There is no buy-ins, no nothing. Nothing costs a dime. And you can use it without any connectivity. You don't need to be connected to get access to any of the tools. There's a lot of tools in here. There are meditations, breathing exercises, and those kinds of things to help people manage some of the symptoms that they have with brain injuries. The other thing is that blue button right on top, it's changed. It's called, now it's named Ask an Expert, but that's a way to get a hold of us. If you ever need to get a hold of us for any reason, it's right there. The other thing is that in this app is a very, very easy access to all the crisis lines. We have recently added the Washington State Crisis Text Line, and would be very happy to consider adding any of the IPV and domestic violence hotlines here too. So it's nice to be able to have that right there at the touch of a button, because some random Tuesday at 2 a.m. is when you need to talk to somebody, and it's hard to remember those numbers. The other thing is that there is a screener on that app, so folks can very anonymously and in the privacy just take that screener and see what a head injury is all about. There's also a bunch of frequently asked questions about what head injury is or brain injury is and what it isn't. And also the screener is going to give that person not a diagnosis at the end, because there's really no way to do that, but it will say may or may not, and be able to kind of start that conversation about what brain injury is and whether or not that is something that we need to start discussing as a part of this person's recovery plan. So that's kind of it, and I appreciate you taking the time to pay attention to little old me. And there's a few minutes left, and with those few minutes left, I'm going to let Heather kind of take it over and see if there are any questions for you out there. Again, I appreciate everything y'all are doing, and I appreciate the work of Linda and the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and allowing us to be here today. So thanks again.
So that was Dan. He recorded this prior to our meeting today. The one thing I can't, say enough about is the fact that you don't have to be a veteran to use any of those resources. Even for our veteran families, a lot of things you hear in the veteran community is service connected, and do you have benefits? Are you retired? Are you this? That few programs This is one of them that you do not have to be service connected to use, which is very rare, which means that I could maybe only spent 2 years in the military, but I would still be able to receive services and resources through this program. The nice thing is in Eastern Washington, we don't have a lot of resources when it comes to TBI. It's just it's a lot more rural for us in this area. So a lot of times what happens is we end up using a lot of our civilian counterparts. So a lot of times we don't even ask if they're veterans. So I don't always ask when somebody calls me and they're asking me questions about traumatic brain injury. I very rarely will even ask them if they are a veteran or if they're service connected, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. As long as we can meet them where they're at that moment, resources into their hands in the fewest number of steps and in the safest way possible. So I know that there was a lot of questions, and obviously Dan is a clinician. I am not a clinician. And so I want to make sure that if there's questions, if I can't answer them, I will find you the answer and I will get it back to you. So you can always, my contact information. I also had 2 handouts, which had a checklist as well as the app stuff. As of Monday, the domestic violence national hotline is now listed in that list that you saw. On the last, I think it was the second to last, we've actually pushed a new update out. So those are for the national and the Washington State domestic violence lines. So if you were to go and download that app, it will be there. And like Dan said, we do not track, it's free. You don't have to put your name in, and it's completely anonymous. Does anybody have any questions?
I'm seeing a couple in the chat box. One about the app is this able to be used by people out of Washington State? So just, I think for me, and what I appreciate about this is the reminder for all of us in all levels of our agency that as we think about advocates, as we think about people in charge of agencies, and right now I'm going back to Becca, and I don't think she would mind the reminder that she herself is a survivor. But we have people all the way through who are experiencing trauma, those we work with and for and alongside of, who have not only experienced trauma, but have also experienced brain injuries. I had a high school brain injury, and I look at these different bits of information and go back to the time that this huge object fell on my head and think, oh yeah, that's me. So that's what my problem has been. And so just the awareness of who you're with and what some of the issues might be and the barriers and obstacles, and being kind and patient with one another as well as with our survivors that we work with. Do folks have thoughts? Have you experienced this? This is, I believe, a safe place, but what is some of the conversation that might be interesting to share, pursue a bit of?
I have a question. This is Joelle from Domestic Violence Services of Snohomish County. Is there a way to help people heal from their traumatic brain injuries?
So best answer for that is no. But no, the reality is a brain injury is not necessarily something that will heal. I think I've had a doctor explain it best as a plate of spaghetti changes. So your brain is very adaptable in the sense that it will always rewire itself to try and overcome that deficit. So I don't want to tell you it will never heal. It's just your brain's smart enough to figure out other methods to be able to meet that need that you're looking at, but it just doesn't look like it will for somebody else. So, I mean, I don't want to say that it's not, I mean, there's a lot of people that have had a concussion or a brain injury that you would never know. They're very functional adults. They're functional children. There's functional teenagers, but you'll note it's often called, it's very quirky. And in actuality, it could be related to that. It's hard to say, especially if they don't relate with traumatic brain injury. I hope that kind of helps, and you might have heard it.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the difference between the trauma impacts, because trauma is something that we can heal from. The brain is wonderfully resilient in so many ways, and there are steps that each person can take in order to heal from trauma if they realize what it is. Whereas with that brain injury, that's not the case. And as was described, as Heather mentioned, people have workarounds. They figure out other ways to do things for the most part. And, it just, it's a different process. And while we're not necessarily clinicians, for us just to have the information, the awareness, and integrate that into our advocacy work, and make sure that we take care of ourselves. That's just a huge message to everybody, and particularly the people who supervise folks, is that we need to take care of ourselves in the patience, the sensitivity that this takes. I just want to say thank you so much to Heather, and I will be expressing my thanks to Dan and to Gary Lott, who made this whole video YouTube thing possible. And I appreciate each and every one of you for being here, for showing up and thinking about what advocacy looks like, what our services package is, how we as agencies can do domestic violence housing first, that approach, because this is all a part of how we do that work. And the reminder when we have financial assistance in any way, how sensitive it is as far as how we do that advocacy work, how we listen to people and believe people, because we're also very good stewards of money. And if there is any hesitation on our part that a survivor might not be presenting in the way that we feel confident about, if the use of the money is at all questionable, there are just so many times where we're balancing that faith and trust in a survivor and our own ability to say, I might make a mistake in this judgment, and that's okay, versus wanting to make sure that whatever the money source is, whether it's a donor, a foundation, or certainly public money, we are identifying what needs to happen in a responsible sort of way. So all of this work, especially what we just have gone through with traumatic brain injuries and trauma impacts, all influence how we make decisions, how we work with survivors, how easy it is to give out that flexible financial assistance. So we won't go into trauma next Tuesday, but it definitely will be referenced here and there as we talk about the money. And then finally, just community engagement. There's a whole new section on our webpage related to community engagement, the tips of the trade, and all of those housing and funding platforms that survivors need for housing stability. All right. Thank you so much, Heather. Thanks, Jackie. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.